Does life actually mean life in terms of sentencing? Well, as you probably know, no, it doesn't. But what about if it's a whole life order? Well, also, not necessarily. So what am I talking about? Well, obviously, in the aftermath of the sentencing of, I'll just say, the Southport defendant, so as not to offend the YouTube algorithm, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that he wasn't eligible for a whole life order because at the time of the offences, he was under the age of 18. Albeit only by 9 days. And currently the sentencing guidelines say that a whole life order cannot be imposed on what is technically a youth offender. And some people have said, well, perhaps the law should change on that. But I'm not sure if that's actually necessary. Would it actually make a material difference? I mean, I can understand the policy reasons for wanting to signify how atrocious these crimes were. But would it make any difference in practical terms? I think the best thing is, first of all, for me to just explain how sentencing generally works, and then to explain specifically about whole life orders. So, as you're probably aware, if somebody gets what we call a determinate sentence, you will go to prison for X number of years. They don't actually serve all that time in the prison. It used to be that for offences where the sentence was under 4 years, you would actually serve half of that sentence and then you would be automatically released. And at some stage, maybe I could go into all the reasons why we shifted to that from the old thing, which is you would serve the whole sentence, but you might get time off for good behaviour, as to where now it's you will actually automatically get time off, and effectively, unless you do something wrong. So the starting position is under 4 years, automatically released at the halfway point. That has changed now. There's an early release provision where actually for certain offences you can actually be released when you've done 40% of your sentence. Some offences are excluded from that, particularly if they involve violence or SUL offending. But then you can be released effectively. You might be on a target, there'll be conditions. Because that's the thing, when you are released early from a sentence, you are still on licence until the actual end of the sentence. And you can be subject to recall at any time. So the idea is, yes, we release you early. However, if you commit another offence, obviously, or even suspected of committing another offence, or you do not abide with your licence conditions. I mean, that could be something like not to go to a particular area, not to contact somebody, not to use the internet or whatever, then you will be automatically recalled to prison to serve potentially the rest of the sentence. I mean, sometimes there will be hearings and it might be, well, we're bringing you back in for a little while, but we will eventually release you even before the end of the sentence. For sentences of more than 4 years, up to 7 years, generally speaking, you have to serve 2/3 of that sentence. And again, it all gets a bit complicated with offences like manslaughter and things like that. But if there's an appetite for this, I can go into a lot more detail about that. But for the purposes of this video, I think that sort of gives the general background. However, if somebody is sentenced to a life sentence, or if they're a young offender, detention during His Majesty's pleasure, it's the same thing, but it's just a different wording. Then again, obviously you wouldn't usually spend the rest of your life in prison, but they set a tariff. And a tariff is the minimum amount of time you must serve before you are eligible for consideration for parole. And in this particular case, the tariff was 52 years. So what does that mean in practice? Well, again, if you are released early by the parole board, you're on what's called a life licence. So for the rest of your life, you are still subject to all those conditions. And if you reoffend, you can be recalled to prison, or if you breach the licence conditions, you can be recalled to prison. But when you get to the end of your tariff, it's not automatic release. It's you have to show to the parole board that it is safe and proper for you to be released. And they can look at all sorts of things, how you've behaved in prison, are you rehabilitated, are you no longer a danger to the public? And effectively it's for the prisoner to actually show that. So in this particular case, let's say it's 52 years. In 52 years' time, when this guy is 70, he could apply to the parole board and say, I am now safe to be released. It's safe to put me back into the community. And if he can show that, then he could be released. If, however, he fails to show that, then he is detained, and generally he has to wait at least another 2 years before he can apply to the parole board again. So when the judge said, it's very likely you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, that is very, very likely, because unless something radically changes, he'll always be considered a danger. Because yes, they're saying, well, he's 70, but older people can commit offences. However, what would have happened if he'd imposed a whole life order? How does a whole life order work? Well, a whole life order, as the name suggests, is we're not going to set a tariff. Basically, you are going to die in prison. However, even when you're on a whole life tariff, you are entitled to apply for parole. Now, rather strangely, of course, there's no fixed term for that. But it would have to be, you'd have to have served a significant part of your sentence just not to get knocked back straight away. But they look at other factors as well. There's something called Section 30, subsection 1 of the Crimes Sentences Act 1997. And that says, provided that, quotes, the Secretary of State may at any time release a life prisoner on licence if he is satisfied that exceptional circumstances exist which justify the prisoner's release on compassionate grounds. So that's the only way you can get out of a whole life order. And I'll go through what those grounds actually are. One, the prisoner is suffering from a terminal illness and death is likely to occur very shortly, or the prisoner is bedridden or similarly incapacitated, and you've got to tick all these boxes. The risk of reoffending, particularly of a sexual or violent nature, is minimal, and further imprisonment would reduce the prisoner's life expectancy, and there are adequate arrangements for the prisoner's care and treatment outside prison, and early release will bring some significant benefit to the prisoner or his or her family. So there you go. So there are the grounds. You have to tick all boxes. So you'll see that most of them are just generally, it's safe to release you because you are physically incapable of committing further offences. And to be quite honest, we just don't want you cluttering up the prison hospital facilities. I mean, like I said, to give another example, this happened, obviously not a life sentence, but with Ronnie Biggs, you might remember, he was released early because, he didn't have very long to live and he was in a very sort of dire state. So they said, look, it's safe. We're not even looking at this on compassionate grounds. We're just looking at this on practical grounds. Why should this come out of all this expensive treatment come out of the prison budget? We'll just load him on the NHS. Just by way of an aside, I was actually in court. I remember it was a bank holiday the day Ronnie Biggs actually surrendered to custody. And it was really strange because he'd done a deal with a newspaper to sort of tell his story. So they had provided all his legal representation. And we got the tip off he was coming. I just dealt with some minor thing that I'd been there for. We actually remember we were in the cells. We actually went in the cells and watched on the monitors as he arrived. And the guy looked like he wouldn't survive the walk to the cells. But the other interesting thing there is he'd brought a full legal team, like 7 lawyers, including a silk. But the district judge just said, this is great, but he said, I've got 2 questions for this guy. And it's like, yeah, are you Ronald Biggs? Yes. Do you accept that you have been unlawfully at large for the last 30 years? Yes. Okay. Back to prison you go. So, the silk was standing up going, I don't know what they were going to say, but it was basically, well, we don't need to hear from you. So that's the sort of thing. So it's not just on whole life sentences and life sentences. Any sentence you can actually theoretically be released early. Now, in terms of whether this actually has happened with a whole life order, the only example I can think of is one of the Lockerbie bombers. You may recall he was released early because apparently he had a terminal illness and then he went back to Libya and there was all the argument as to whether it was real or whether he'd been faking it. But that's the only example. Now, just to bring the European Convention on Human Rights into this and the European Court on Human Rights, get those controversy clicks. A few years ago, the ECHR, the court, actually said the whole life tariff is incompatible with Article 3 of the Convention because they said it's inhuman or degrading treatment to say that there is literally no chance you can ever get out, even though, like I say, technically there are ways that you can get out. But they said there must at least be a glimmer of hope for people that they can show they have rehabilitated and they are safe. So initially there was a knockback, but we have this idea called the margin of appreciation, which is individual countries that have signed up to the ECHR. They don't all have to apply the rules in the same way. They are allowed to take into account their sort of local customs, their local, and just the fact that they are sovereign nations. So the margin of appreciation is the wriggle room in how you actually apply all the various protections within the convention. So initially they knocked it back and said whole life sentences fall foul of Article 3. However, there was later a case called Hutchinson where they said, actually, bear in mind there is this proviso that if, there is a possibility that you can apply for parole on compassionate grounds and you can get out. In that case, it is actually compatible with the ECHR. So that's the position at the moment. So whole life orders are certainly lawful, both under domestic law and under the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. In practice, as we have seen, like I said, the only example I can find of somebody ever being released from a whole life order was the Lockerbie bomber, because they said you don't have much longer to live. And obviously the risk of reoffending is relatively low. So in practice then, if the Southport guy had been sentenced to a whole life order, would it make any difference in practice? Well, probably not, because even if it's on a whole life order, by the time he'd served 52 years, he could probably apply anyway and say, look, I can be it's safe to release me. I'm a 70-year-old guy now. There is no risk to the public. Although, like I say, he'd have to show effectively he's on physical grounds, whereas theoretically, because he's actually on a tariff that's not whole life order, he doesn't necessarily have to show he's got a terminal illness. He just has to show he's no longer a risk. But the fact of the matter is, the court's likely to look at this and say, while you are physically capable of moving around and existing, then no, you present a risk. And there's the impact on the victims. I mean, the poor surviving children, they'll only be in their 50s. So, knowing that there is the possibility that this person could get out, obviously that's something that will understandably play on their mind. I mean, now the rules are, victims are informed of parole hearings and they can make submissions themselves as to the impact and the effect on that. But realistically, unless some bizarre happens with this guy, he de-radicalizes or he starts doing lectures to young people in prison about, how I ended up on this path and why you shouldn't do it and all that sort of thing, then realistically, he is very, very unlikely to be released anyway, even though he's not on a whole life order. But that's a distinction. Like I say, in practical terms, the whole life order, you have to sort of show that I am physically incapable of committing any further offences. Whereas with a tariff, it's, I am physically capable, but assessing everything, there is no risk. So obviously a whole life order would be a slightly tougher regime. But like I say, I just think in practical terms, I won't make one of my, maybe I should make one of my predictions and just assume I'm still going to be around here in 2066. But those are the factors. So, might it be that we'll see a change in this and they'll allow whole life orders for under 18s? I mean, that would almost certainly be subject to an ECH challenge because, generally speaking, they accept that young people should be treated differently. Now, it is very arbitrary because, like I say, this was a 9-day difference. So maybe it would be a situation, well, we would take that into account. Putting a whole life tariff on somebody who's almost 18 is allowable because otherwise, it becomes a bit strange to have this bright line in the sand where this is what happens in this situation, and as soon as you hit midnight on this particular day, it's a completely different regime. But there you go. I mean, I'm not offering any opinions on the sort of morality of this, but I just thought I'd just set out the actual legal technicalities. So when you see people discussing this, you can actually appreciate what exactly it would mean in practice. So there you go. As always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely informative. I think that's reasonably accurate because I've got a copy of the relevant act in front of me just to make sure that I got it right. I'll just move here just for the thumbnail.